Hi, everyone. Happy Sunday. It is April 11th, 2021. This Wednesday, the City Council will be introducing the Boston City budget for our fiscal year 2022. In anticipation of that, I thought it would be a wonderful idea to kind of go over the budgeting process that the City Council will anticipate on Wednesday. I thought it would be a good idea to kind of review the PowerPoint presentation that the administration finance team gave to the city last year to kind of break it down into more digestible pieces for anyone that's going to be looking at the city's budget this year. So hopefully you can see my screen right now. I have the PowerPoint presentation that was presented last year by Justin Sterrett, who was the director of the Office of Budget and Management. I believe he was recently appointed as the CFO for the city for this year. He did a wonderful job on his PowerPoint presentation, so I thought it would be a great idea to borrow that and use it when explaining the budget for this year. So as we start with the budget, we kind of have to, we generally go over kind of the overview things that we're looking to accomplish with our budget. First and foremost, we're looking at the fact that the city has a AAA bond rating. We've had one for the past 6 years, I believe now 7 years in a row. AAA bond rating is incredibly important. It allows the city to borrow debt at a lower interest rate. This ends up saving the city of Boston millions of dollars, particularly when we're looking at doing capital projects or just funding our normal operating expenses. So keeping a AAA bond rating is incredibly important. It lets us borrow at a lower interest rate. Similar to buying a house with a lower interest rate, your debt payments are lower, gives us a lot more flexibility when we're looking at our doing our financing. When the A&F team presents on Wednesday, they'll probably give us some additional feedback of probably how COVID's impacted the budget this year, other things to look forward to in the upcoming year ahead. Generally, we'll start by looking at the revenue for the past fiscal year. Again, I'm using last year's presentation, so the numbers will be different on Wednesday. Last year, we had a revenue of $3.6 billion, 3.647. So a lot of people don't know that about 72% of our city's revenue comes from property taxes. That's this blue bar here. It's outlined here as well as the top line. So about $2.6 billion last year came from the city's property taxes. That's both residential property and commercial property. Additionally, the city gets about 13% of its funding from the state. This number varies year to year. In the past, it was higher. During the last recession in 06, 07, we saw it take a bit of a dip. So hopefully, based on the city's or the state's own budgeting process, it kind of impacts what that percentage will be. But generally, the city of Boston will have conversations with the state, so we're not caught off guard. But typically around 13%, what it's been the last few years, which comes out to about $474 million. After that, we get department revenue. Think of things like parking tickets, things along that nature, permitting fees. So these are dollars that come into the city's doors through collections from its various departments. And then last, we have our excise tax, which is built up of a couple different things. It's lodging tax, a meals tax, and a jet fuel tax. I'll be talking about that a little bit in a few minutes here as we go through each factor that makes up our revenue pool. So again, property taxes represent 72% of the revenue for the city of Boston, about $2.6 billion. So what does this mean? So typically everyone receives a property tax bill every year. And because of something called Proposition 2.5, the city is capped at growing that tax figure number by 2.5% per year. So naturally, the city of Boston has, say, 100 properties. It gets, let's say, $100 in real property taxes every year. The city could only increase that property tax amount by 2.5%. So it'd be $2.50. Well, how do we grow that pie? The way that the city grows that pie is by building new properties. If you're building new properties, you're building out a larger property tax base. That's why you've seen such emphasis on making sure that the city continues to grow its property tax base to fund all the programs that operate the city. But we were also trying to make sure that we're growing, intelligently with, collaborative community viewpoint. So 72% of the city's revenue comes from property taxes. They're capped in terms of growth by 2.5%. The only way to grow that pie is by new development projects. In last year's presentation, they talked about 6.1% of the property taxes coming into the city were due to new developments. Here we see listed as new growth added to the base for new construction. So here again is another great figure talking about residential taxes growing in the city over the last couple decades. And again, here we see the property tax growth over the last couple decades here. And we've seen how it's, substantially grown since the, even the early aughts. So as we scroll down, we are now at state aid. State aid is about 13% of our city's revenue. This number, again, is kind of predicated on the state's overall budget and what the state determines is the need for the city of Boston. Hopefully we get to, due to, federal stimulus funding, we'll see an increase in this funding this year. That would be great to kind of offset some of the losses that we may have had due to the negative impacts of COVID. So our state aid's 13%, or about $474 million. It's also where we see a lot of our federal grant money come in, especially for education. So that's our state aid. And of course, while the city of Boston's doing their state budgeting, while the city of Boston's doing its budgeting process, we're also seeing the state operate on a parallel path, trying to pass their budget as well. So this was a great slide that they included last year, talking about the changing blend of revenue over the past 2 decades. The city of Boston wasn't always so reliant on property tax. In the early 2000s, it only constituted 50% of the city's revenue. But again, because of, at that time, the state was actually contributing 30% of our city's revenue. Or now it's 13%, it was almost a third just in 2002. We saw it shrink pretty significantly after the Great Recession. In fiscal year 2011, it decreased to about 16%. So hopefully, again, this year, we're hoping to stay at least at 13%. Hopefully we can grow a little bit further due to the federal relief that'll be coming in response to the new stimulus package that was passed. So as we continue going down, we're going to see department revenue, which represents about 10% of the city's revenue, or $364 million. This tends to be pretty consistent year to year, even though, we'll occasionally increase the fine totals. You typically have the same amount of offenders every year, so you can kind of more or less peg in where this number is going to be around. It stayed consistent the last few years. So we're anticipating it to be about $364 million. And then as we go down, we also see our pilot payments. Pilot payments are the payment of lieu of taxes, which are contributed by our institutional actors in the city. So think of hospitals, educational institutes, things of that nature. This is a program agreement that the city set up. I believe it was in 2010. So we've seen the pilot program really, be formalized. We're hoping to see that figure continue to grow as we see our institutions in Boston grow as well. That's something that we've tried to address in our most recent city council year, then city council president Janey actually set up the first pilot committee, which was in charge of kind of looking back through the pilot agreement that we have set up with these institutional actors and trying to find a more formalized way to peg not only the monetary payments that they make to the city, but also the community benefits, trying to have a more formalized process there so that we can have, you know, a good partnership as city and private actors going forward. So excise tax is actually the smallest proportion of our tax revenue. It's about 5% or $188 million. This is probably the portion of our revenue that's going to be most impacted in this current year's fiscal budget. The reason for that is our excise tax is based on these 4 categories: room occupancy, motor vehicles, meals, aircraft fuel. So room occupancy and meals obviously were incredibly impacted by COVID. For this excise tax, room occupancy actually constitutes 46% of it. So I think even though it's only 5% of the budget, you know, that's $188 million, with room occupancy being about 97 million of that. So I think, you know, we're really going to see an impact in this category. I'm not sure exactly what the figure is going to be. We're going to have to wait to see it on Wednesday, but I think this is where we might see a decline from last year's year-to-year increase. Where we've seen a year-to-year increase over the past few years, we're going to probably see a bit of a deficit here. So I'm interested to see if we're able to make up in other areas, but I think this is definitely where we're going to want to take a look to see how COVID impacted the city's revenues for the past year. So going forward, we're also going to look at fiscal year 2021 spending. Again, this is based on last year's budget presentation, so it may look different this year. However, I thought, you know, in anticipation of Wednesday's budget drop, it'd still be great to kind of go through and kind of see the proportions that each department get and kind of how our dollars are spent in the city. So the city of Boston operates at about a $3.5 billion operating budget. The way that that's broken down is city departments represent about $1.5 billion of that spending. $100 million of that spending is for our public health commission. And then our public education actually consists about a third of our city's operating budget at $1.4 billion. And then we have these things that are fixed costs, which I'll talk about our slide below, that represent about $500 million. So you've seen, you know, these numbers tend to stay pretty consistent year to year, unless there's a new initiative that the mayoral administration may try to roll out, the creation of a new department. Otherwise, you'll see a pretty predictable increase in expenses based on things like, you know, scheduled pay raises for employees, scheduled maintenance for city-owned buildings, which will be in the capital budget, operating budget, things that, you know, your typical cost to run an operating program, such as, you know, neighborhood outreach, things like that. So again, we see here the breakout of the pie of the city's operating budget. It's about 3.647 billion. You have public education, again, representing, you know, 1.4 billion of that 3.6, fixed costs, 500 million, public health, 103, health insurance, 260 million, transportation, 263, city departments, 334 million, and then public safety, 690 million. And I'm going to show everyone in a little bit where you can find this broken out in further detail on the city's website. They'll have it broken out by each department, so you can see exactly how much each department's operating budget is using to operate. So the mayoral administration will make a presentation this year. Usually they'll highlight on their operating budget, the new programs again that they're looking to use the funds for. This past year, I believe they made a big a large part of their presentation was talking about the new influx of capital going into BPS's budget. I believe it was $33 million per year over the next 3 years to fund some new programs that they're doing. So typically this is where you'll see mayoral administration really kind of make a splash on, where they're really trying to allocate funds for new programs, what things that they're stressing for their administration, things of that nature. Here we again talk about fixed costs, things like pension and debt. The city's trying to fully fund their pension program by 2025. This is an important goal for the city. I'm actually going to take a second to highlight this. So part of the reason the city of Boston has such a strong credit rating is because we're working towards a fully funded pension program. This just really helps stress the strong economic condition of the city for people that are looking at us. We have a fully funded fixed cost expense, going forward. So that's one of the things that, it's a little drier to talk about a fully funded pension plan. But again, when you're talking about the overall health of the city's economy and the way it may impact our, bond rating, it's an important thing to take note of. City departments, again, here's a really broad overview. The largest proportion of cost for a city department is always going to be their personnel. You just think about it, it just logistically makes sense that the cost to hire a employee, as well as their health benefits, are typically the broad cost of how a city department operates. You have other smaller costs that you'll see here, such as, buying supplies for the office, special appropriation, city contracts for, small upkeeps of things within these departments. Again, I'm going to highlight a page where you'll be able to see broken down in greater detail the cost for every department. Here we see some other things that were highlighted in last year's budget. I'm just going to kind of skip over them because, again, I don't know how this year's presentation is going to be presented and what changes we're going to be seeing.